The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday morning, Edmund Greer had already made up his mind. He read it twice, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to be sure the boy was real. A son, she had written. 5 years old. His name is Thomas. He is quiet and well-behaved, and I promise you will not even know he is there. Edmund folded the letter into a neat square, slid it into the breast pocket of his coat, and walked out of the telegraph office without sending a single word back. He never went to the station. He didn't even watch from a distance. He simply went home, poured himself a glass of whiskey, and told himself that a woman who came with a child was a woman who came with a problem. And Edmund Greer had enough of those already. Somewhere across town, at the Harlan Creek Railway Station, a young woman named Eliza Monroe sat on a wooden bench with a small trunk at her feet and a 5-year-old boy pressed against her side. She had been sitting there for 3 hours. The afternoon sun hammered the platform boards. Thomas had stopped asking questions an hour ago, which frightened her more than his crying ever could. When a child goes quiet like that, not peaceful quiet, but the kind of quiet that comes from slowly understanding something is wrong, a mother feels it in her chest like a splinter working its way toward the heart. She checked the letter again. Edmund Greer. Harlan Creek, Texas, June the 14th. She had the right town, the right date, the right name. The man simply wasn't there. Caleb Whitaker had not planned to be at the Harlan Creek station that afternoon. He had come to send a wire to a feed supplier in Abilene, a last attempt to negotiate an extension on a debt that was already 6 weeks past due. The wire cost him 32 cents, which left him with less than $2 in his coat pocket and a 4-mile ride back to a ranch that was slowly dying underneath him. He was walking back to his horse when he saw her. Not because she was beautiful, though she was. In the way that exhausted, frightened women sometimes are, all the pretense stripped away and just the person left underneath. He noticed her because of the boy. Thomas was sitting very straight beside his mother, both small hands gripping the bench slat, staring at the station entrance with an expression no 5-year-old should have to carry. It was the expression of someone waiting for something they have already stopped believing in. Caleb recognized it immediately. He had seen it in the mirror for 3 years. He slowed his steps. A station worker named Pete Dunbar was sweeping near the entrance, and Caleb caught him by the arm. "Those two been here long?" Pete glanced over his shoulder without much interest. "Since the noon train. She's asking about some fella named Greer." He snorted. "Edmund Greer. You know what that man is. Soon as he found out she had the boy with her, he wired his neighbor to pass along that he'd changed his mind. Didn't even have the spine to come himself." Caleb felt something cold move through him. "She know yet?" "Told her an hour ago." Pete went back to sweeping. "Not my problem what she does about it. Station master says if she don't have a ticket somewhere by nightfall, we're moving her along." Moving her along. Caleb had heard that phrase used about stray dogs. He stood there for a moment, hands at his sides, watching the boy's rigid little back. Thomas hadn't moved, hadn't looked around. He was holding himself together with everything he had, and he was 5 years old, and Caleb Whitaker felt something shift in his chest that he hadn't felt in a very long time, something that felt uncomfortably like rage. He walked toward them. I didn't have a plan. He wanted to be clear about that, even in his own mind. He was not a man who made speeches or performed kindnesses for an audience. He walked toward that bench because he could not walk away from it, and that was the sum total of his reasoning. "Ma'am." Eliza looked up. Her eyes were dry, which told him more than tears would have. Women who had cried themselves out looked like that, calm in a way that wasn't calm at all, just emptied. She had brown hair pinned back from a face that might have been pretty when she wasn't holding herself together with both hands. She was younger than he'd expected. 24, maybe 25. "I'm not looking for charity," she said immediately. Didn't offer any. He took off his hat, which seemed like the right thing to do, though he felt awkward doing it. "My name's Caleb Whitaker. I've got a ranch about 4 miles north of here. The Broken Spur, though I didn't name it that, it came that way." He paused. "It's not much. The well is half gone, and the cattle are thin, and the house needs work. But it's got a roof and 2 extra rooms, and it's better than this bench." She stared at him. "You don't know me." "No." "You don't know my son." "No." "Then why would you—" "Because Pete Dunbar just told me what Edmund Greer did," Caleb said. And I've met Greer twice in my life, and both times he made me feel like something was wrong with the world. And because your boy has been sitting there for an hour trying to be a man, and he's 5, and that's not right." Something moved across Eliza's face. Not gratitude, not yet. More like the look of someone who has been fooled before and is trying to determine whether this is another version of the same trick. Thomas turned and looked at Caleb for the first time. He had his mother's eyes, dark brown, very serious. He was holding a small wooden horse, the paint worn thin from handling, and he held it in front of him like it was something precious. "Do you have horses?" the boy asked. Caleb blinked. "I've got 4. One of them's a colt. About your age, actually." Thomas considered this with great seriousness. "Is he a good horse?" "He's stubborn, and he bites fence posts when he's bored. But he's got a good heart." For just a moment, the barest flicker, Thomas almost smiled. Then he pressed his lips together and looked at his mother, because he was 5 years old and had already learned that decisions were not his to make. Eliza was still watching Caleb, measuring him. He held her gaze and didn't offer anything else because he had nothing else to offer, and he was not in the habit of lying to make himself look better. "1 week," she said finally. "We'll stay 1 week, and then I'll figure something out." "That's fair?" She stood, straightened her coat, and picked up the trunk before he could offer to take it. He took it anyway. She let him, which he suspected was costing her something. They walked to his horse in silence. When Caleb lifted Thomas up to sit in front of the saddle, the boy gripped the pommel with both hands and looked down at the ground with wide eyes. "It's a long way up," Thomas said. "It is." Caleb swung up behind him. "But I've got you." The ride back to the broken spur took 40 minutes, and Caleb spent most of it trying to remember the last time another person had been on this road with him. He couldn't. The ranch came into view around the last bend in the trail, and even in the golden afternoon light, it looked like what it was, a place that had been fighting to survive for a long time and was starting to lose. The main house was a long, low structure built from cedar planks gone gray with weathering. The barn leaned slightly to the left. The fence along the south pasture had 3 sections down. The vegetable patch beside the house had gone to dry weeds. The whole place had the particular stillness of somewhere that had been quiet too long. Thomas looked at it without saying anything. Eliza looked at it and said, "It's got good bones." Caleb glanced at her. He hadn't expected that. "The roof's good," she continued, studying the house with the focused eyes of someone assessing rather than judging. "The barn just needs a post, and that fence," she tilted her head. "How many sections are down?" 3 on the south, 1 on the north. The cattle stay in the north pasture? Yes. Then the south fence can wait. She looked at him. What needs doing first? He hadn't been asked that question in 3 years. He'd been making his own list for so long that someone else asking felt almost startling. "The well," he said. "If we don't get the well producing, nothing else matters." She nodded, like this was a problem to be solved rather than a catastrophe to be mourned. "Show me." That first evening was awkward in the way that all first evenings are when strangers are pretending they are not strangers. Eliza moved through the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had cooked in difficult circumstances before. She found flour and dried beans and a tin of lard and built a meal out of them that Caleb wouldn't have thought possible. Thomas sat at the kitchen table with his wooden horse and watched everything with those serious dark eyes, occasionally asking quiet questions that Eliza answered without stopping her work. Caleb sat on the porch. He was not trying to be rude. He was trying to give them space, and he was also trying to figure out what had just happened to his life. 3 hours ago, he had been a man alone in a dying ranch. Now there was the smell of cornbread coming through his kitchen window, and a woman he'd met that afternoon reorganizing his shelves, and none of it was something he had planned. He heard Thomas's voice from inside, low and careful. "Mama, is he nice?" A pause. Then Eliza. "I think so. He has sad eyes." Another pause. Caleb went very still, though he was sure they couldn't see him from where they were. "Some people do," Eliza said quietly. "It doesn't mean they're sad all the way through." Caleb looked out at the dark pasture where his cattle stood in shapes against the fading sky. He thought about the wife he'd lost, about the baby that didn't make it, about the years since then that had been just work and silence, and the slow conviction that this was what his life was now, and it was foolish to expect anything different. He was not a man who cried, but he sat with something pressing against the inside of his ribs for a while, quiet and formless, until Eliza appeared in the doorway and told him supper was ready. 3 days passed. Caleb noticed things. Small things. The kind you can't help noticing when someone is suddenly living in your space. Eliza was up before him every morning, not to impress him, he understood, but because she was a woman who had gotten into the habit of getting up early when sleeping late meant losing ground. She had reorganized the kitchen on day one, quietly and without asking, and the result was that he could actually find things now, which bothered him slightly because it suggested the previous arrangement had been chaotic. Thomas followed Caleb from a distance at first. Not close enough to be in the way, but close enough to watch everything. He asked questions about the cattle, about the fence posts, about why the colt pawed the ground when he was nervous. Because he doesn't know what's going to happen next, Caleb said, and he doesn't like not knowing. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Me too, he said. Caleb looked at him. The colt gets over it when he sees the situation is safe. How long does that take? Depends on the situation. Thomas thought about this seriously. Then he went back to watching the colt through the fence slats with an expression that said he understood completely. On the 4th morning, Caleb found Eliza at the well before dawn. She had already pulled up the bucket twice and was studying the water level with a lantern held out over the edge. The water was low. He already knew it. But the way she was looking at it suggested she had been thinking about it all night. "We could dig it deeper," she said when she heard him coming. "Or," she straightened, "there's a low spot on the north side of the property. I walked it yesterday." "If you dug a cistern there and channeled the runoff from the barn roof, a reservoir." Caleb stopped. He had thought about this. He'd thought about it for 2 years. "That's a lot of digging." "Yes. Town council says nobody digs reservoirs, say the ground's too hard." "Have any of them tried?" He looked at her in the lantern light. She wasn't challenging him. She wasn't that kind of woman. She was asking a genuine question, and the answer was no. Nobody had tried. And he'd never tried either because it was the kind of idea that died in the space between thinking of it and actually picking up a shovel. "It would take weeks," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "It would." She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. She picked up the lantern and walked back to the house to start breakfast. And Caleb stood at the well in the dark, thinking about the kind of woman who spent her evenings walking the edge of a stranger's property, looking for solutions to his water problem. Not because she had been asked to, not because she owed him anything, but because that was apparently who she was. The trouble with Grant Holloway started on day 5, though Caleb didn't know it yet. He found out the following week when Holloway's ranch hand, a wide, flat-faced man named Dex, came riding up the Broken Spur's main trail on a horse that cost more than Caleb's entire cattle herd. Dex had a way of delivering messages that made them feel like threats, even when the words themselves weren't. He handed Caleb an envelope without getting down from his horse. "Mr. Holloway says he'd like to talk, at your earliest convenience." Dex looked around the ranch with the particular expression of a man calculating what something is worth. His eyes stopped on Eliza, who was beating a rug on the porch without looking up. They stayed there a beat too long. "Tell Holloway I'll come when I'm able," Caleb said. Dex looked back at him. Something in his face changed. Not threatening exactly, but the way a sky changes before weather. "Mr. Holloway generally prefers sooner." "I expect he does." Dex sat there for one more moment, then turned his horse and rode back down the trail without another word. Eliza waited until the sound of hoofbeats faded. Then, "Who is Grant Holloway?" Caleb watched the dust settle. "The richest man in the county. Owns most of the valley east of here. Been buying up land from farmers who couldn't survive the drought." He paused. "I've turned him down twice already." Eliza said nothing. She went back to beating the rug. But that night, after Thomas was in bed, she appeared in the doorway of the parlor where Caleb was going over his accounts. A grim exercise he performed every few weeks to confirm that the situation was exactly as bad as he remembered. "If Holloway wants the land," she said, "he'll want the water rights too." Caleb looked up. "If you build that reservoir," she continued, "and it works, the water value of this property goes up considerably." She paused. "Which means his offer might go up too, or his pressure might." Caleb set down his pencil. "You know something about water rights?" "I grew up on a farm in Missouri. My father lost it to a man who understood water rights better than he did. She met his eyes steadily. I know what it looks like when someone is waiting for the right moment to move. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. 3 years alone. 3 years of nobody at the supper table, nobody walking his fence line, nobody looking at his problems and thinking about solutions. And now here was a woman he had known for 8 days who had already figured out what Grant Holloway was planning before Caleb had fully admitted it to himself. He's going to make another offer, Caleb said. Yes. And when I refuse? She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was very quiet. I don't know, but I think we should have that reservoir dug before we find out. They started digging the next morning. Caleb had expected her to help plan it. He had not expected her to pick up a shovel. But at 7 in the morning, while Thomas played near the barn, Eliza appeared in the north pasture in her oldest dress with her sleeves rolled to the elbows and a spade over her shoulder, and she started digging. Caleb stood there looking at her. You gave us a home, she said, not stopping. The least we can do is help you keep yours. He had not been ready for that sentence. He turned away before she could see his face and picked up his own shovel, and they dug. The ground was exactly as hard as everyone said it was. The first hour produced blisters on both their hands and less than a foot of progress. Thomas brought them water in an old canteen and then sat at the edge and watched with the focused attention he brought to everything, and occasionally reported his observations about their technique, which were surprisingly accurate. By noon they had 2 feet. By afternoon, 3. Caleb's shoulders ached in a way they hadn't since he was a younger man. Eliza didn't complain. Not once, though he could see the pain in the set of her jaw and the careful way she held the shovel handle. You can stop, he said. I know. She kept digging. The evening came down slow and orange, and they sat on the edge of what would eventually be a reservoir, a muddy 3-foot-deep hole in hard Texas ground that bore very little resemblance to what it needed to become. And neither of them said anything for a while. Thomas came and sat between them. He still had his wooden horse. He pressed it against the edge of the hole and made it walk along the rim. What is this going to be? He asked. A place to hold water, Caleb said. So when it doesn't rain for a long time, we'll still have some. Thomas turned this over. Is it hard to build? Yes. Will it work? I think so, if we do it right. Thomas nodded. He moved the wooden horse a few more steps along the rim. Then he looked up at Caleb with those serious dark eyes and said, with the complete sincerity that only a 5-year-old can muster, then we should keep doing it. Caleb looked at him. This boy who wasn't his, this woman who wasn't his, this hard piece of Texas ground that might kill every dream he'd ever planted in it. Yeah, he said. I think you're right. Somewhere down the valley, where Grant Holloway's light still burned past dark, somebody was making plans that Caleb didn't know about yet. But right now, in the fading orange light, with a small wooden horse walking the rim of a half-dug hole, and a woman who hadn't complained once through 3 hours of brutal work sitting 3 feet to his right, Caleb Whitaker felt something he had stopped expecting. He felt like tomorrow might be different. He was not yet sure if that was hope or something more dangerous, but he supposed he was about to find out. They dug for 11 days. Not every hour of every day. There were cattle to feed, fences to check, meals to cook, a boy to keep occupied. But every morning when the light was still gray and the ground was coolest, Caleb and Eliza were in the north pasture with their shovels, and every evening before the dark made it impossible they were there again. The hole grew slowly, the way things grow when they cost you something. 3 feet became 5. 5 became 8. The walls of the excavation went from crumbling dry dirt to a harder, darker layer of clay that resisted the shovel with a sound like a complaint. Caleb's blisters burst and healed and burst again. He didn't mention them. Eliza wrapped her hands in strips of cloth torn from an old apron and didn't mention hers either. This became one of the unspoken agreements between them, that neither would acknowledge pain to the other, not because they were pretending it wasn't there, but because acknowledging it would have required them to also acknowledge how much they were both depending on the other to keep going. Thomas helped in the ways available to a 5-year-old. He carried water. He moved small rocks from the pile to a spot Caleb designated. He sat on the edge of the growing reservoir hole and reported with great seriousness how far down he could see, which Caleb told him was extremely useful information. It was not extremely useful information. But the boy needed to feel that he was part of this, and Caleb had learned enough about Thomas Monroe in 11 days to know that being excluded from things he couldn't control was the thing that frightened him most. On the morning of the 12th day, Caleb's shovel hit something wet. He thought at first he had imagined it. The ground here was bone dry, had been bone dry since he'd owned this land, and before that too, according to the previous owner who had sold it to him at a price that reflected the drought. He pressed the shovel tip into the spot again. Dark, damp earth clung to the blade. He dug 6 more inches with his hands. The moisture increased. He sat back on his heels and looked at the dark smear of wet clay on his palms, and didn't say anything for a long time because he was afraid to. He had been wrong before. He had believed in things before that turned out to be nothing. Eliza came up behind him and looked over his shoulder. She said nothing either. Then Thomas, who had appeared at the rim above them, "Why did you stop?" Caleb looked up at him. "Because I hit wet ground." Thomas stared at him. "Is that good?" "It might be. It's too early to say." Thomas considered this with his characteristic gravity. Then, "But it might be good." "Yeah." Caleb looked back at the dark earth in his hands. "It might be." He didn't let himself smile until he'd turned away from both of them. The news traveled in the way that all news traveled in Harlan Creek, through the feed store, through the barber shop, through the particular network of women who talked over back fences and at the dry goods counter, and within 4 days there was not a person in town who didn't know that the Whitaker Ranch was digging a reservoir and had struck something promising underneath. Most people said it wouldn't work, not cruelly, or not most of them anyway. It was the considered judgment of men who had farmed and ranched this ground for 20 years and watched 100 ideas die in the dust. The McCready brothers told anyone who would listen that the aquifer in that valley had been tapped out since 1881. Old Pastor Henry's said, not the church kind, just a man unfortunate enough to have been named that, said the water would sour within a month even if they found it. The general consensus was that Caleb Whitaker had lost his practical sense, which was the last thing standing between him and disaster. What nobody said out loud, but what most people understood, was that this was also about the woman. Harlan Creek had opinions about Eliza Monroe. She was a mail-order bride whose intended had rejected her, which made her, in the accounting of certain people, both a sympathetic figure and a suspicious one. Women who arrived without family, without local connections, without a clear place in the existing order of things, they made people uncomfortable in ways that were hard to articulate and easy to dress up as concern. The women who talked over back fences said they hoped she was decent. The men who talked in the feed store said Caleb was a fool. A few people said both. Martha Ogle, who ran the dry goods store with her husband and had known Caleb since before his wife died, caught him one afternoon when he came in for rope and nails. "People are talking," she said not unkindly. "I expect they are." Caleb counted out the nails he needed. "You know what they're saying?" "I can guess." Martha watched him for a moment. She was a solid, practical woman who had raised 5 children on frontier land and had very little patience for situations she couldn't do anything about, which meant she focused her considerable energy on situations she could. "Is she a good woman?" Caleb thought about Eliza at the edge of the reservoir hole with clay on her hands and strips of apron cloth around her blisters. He thought about the way she'd looked at his accounts that first night, not judging, just calculating, the way you calculate when you're trying to figure out how to solve a problem. He thought about the morning she'd made Thomas laugh, really laugh, the full-body kind, by imitating one of the barn cats attempting to catch a moth, unself-conscious and ridiculous and human in a way that had surprised him completely. "Yes," he said, "she's a good woman." Martha nodded, like this confirmed something she had already decided. "Then tell her to come in and introduce herself. Half the problem is that nobody's met her. People are afraid of what they don't know." Caleb looked at her. "She's not here to perform for the town." "No, but the town doesn't have to like her for her sake. She's going to be living here. It helps if they do." He brought this back to Eliza that evening, inexpertly, which meant he said, "Martha Ogle at the dry goods says you ought to come in and meet people," and then stood there looking like he wished he'd phrased it differently. Eliza was quiet for a moment. Then, "Are they saying things about me?" He hesitated a half-second too long. "Caleb." "Some are. Not Martha. Martha's sensible." Eliza looked at the table. She had the look of a woman deciding which feeling to allow herself and which to fold up and put away. She was very practiced at that look. He had seen it every day since she arrived, that small internal negotiation between what she felt and what she allowed herself to show. "All right," she said. "Next time you go in, Thomas and I will come." He waited for her to say something else, something that revealed what the town's opinion cost her. She didn't. She went back to the pot on the stove, and that was that. Thomas, from his spot at the table where he was ostensibly doing nothing but was in fact listening to everything, said, "Are people saying bad things about Mama?" "Some people say things without thinking," Caleb said. "It's not about your mother. It's about them not knowing her yet." Thomas thought about this. "When they know her, will they stop?" "Most of them will." "What about the rest?" Caleb looked at him. "The rest aren't worth worrying about." Thomas appeared to accept this, though the small furrow between his eyebrows suggested he was filing it away for further consideration. They went to town on a Saturday, which was the sensible day to go because most people were in on Saturdays, and it was better to have one difficult afternoon than 6 separate difficult encounters spread across the week. Caleb had not fully thought through what it would look like, walking down the main street of Harlan Creek with a woman and a child. He had been alone for so long that he had stopped thinking about what he looked like to other people at all, which meant he was unprepared for the particular quality of attention that followed them from the moment they tied his horse at the rail. People looked. Some nodded. Some found something interesting to examine on the other side of the street. Pete Dunbar, from the station, lifted his hat to Eliza with an expression that couldn't quite decide whether it was apologetic or not. Eliza nodded back with perfect composure, which Caleb suspected was costing her considerably. At the dry goods, Martha Ogle came around the counter immediately and shook Eliza's hand with both of hers, which was the frontier equivalent of a full embrace. "I've heard about the reservoir project," she said. "How's the progress?" "Slow," Eliza said, "but real." Martha glanced at Thomas, who was examining a jar of penny candy with the focused attention of someone inspecting a legal document. "And this is the young man." Thomas looked up. He had very good manners. Not the stiff, fearful kind, but the genuine kind that came from a mother who had taught him that how you treated people said something about who you were. "Thomas Monroe, ma'am. I'm 5. "I can see that you're very 5, Martha said, with enough warmth that even Caleb felt it. She looked at Eliza. "Smart eyes." "Too smart," Eliza said. "Here's everything." "That's a useful quality," Martha said, "as long as the people around him are worth listening to." The afternoon was not uniformly easy. There were 2 women at the far end of the dry goods who did not come to introduce themselves, and whose whispered conversation dropped in volume when Eliza walked past. There was a man outside the feed store who looked at Caleb with an expression that said things without saying them. And there was a moment, brief but real, when Thomas tugged at Eliza's hand and asked why that lady was looking at them like that, and Eliza said quietly, "Because she doesn't know us yet." And Thomas said, "But we're nice." And Eliza said, "Yes, we are," in a voice so steady that Caleb couldn't tell if she was reassuring the boy or herself. But there was also the baker's wife, who came out of her shop to give Thomas a small cinnamon roll and tell Eliza she had heard about the reservoir and thought it was the bravest thing she'd heard of in years. There was the sheriff, a weathered man named Archibald Tull, who shook both their hands and said he was glad to know the Whitaker Ranch had some life in it again. And he said it looking at Caleb when he did, which Caleb understood. And there was the ride home, with Thomas sitting in front of Caleb on the horse again, more at ease now than that first ride had been, holding the pommel with one hand and his wooden horse with the other, and telling Eliza, who rode behind on the second horse they'd borrowed from the barn, about everything he had observed in town with the thoroughness of a reporter filing a story. Eliza listened to all of it, asked questions at the right moments, laughed at the right moments. And when Thomas had exhausted his inventory of observations and lapsed into the comfortable silence of a tired child, she looked across at Caleb with an expression that was complicated and quiet, and a little raw at the edges. "It'll get easier," he said. "I know." She looked ahead at the trail. "It's not the first time I've had to earn a place." He wanted to ask about that, about the before, the Missouri farm, the life she'd come from that had eventually landed her on a railway platform with a trunk and a small boy and a ticket to meet a man who didn't want her. But it wasn't the right moment, and he was not a man who pushed, so he let it go, and they rode the rest of the way in silence that wasn't uncomfortable. Grant Holloway came himself this time. He came on a Wednesday, which was calculated, not the weekend, when a man might have company, not a weekday morning, when work would be an excuse to cut things short. Wednesday afternoon, when the day was half done and a man was tired enough to be less careful. Holloway was good at calculation. That was, Caleb had come to understand, the core of what he was. He rode a gray horse that was the finest animal Caleb had seen in years, and he came alone, which was either a gesture of good faith or a demonstration of confidence. Caleb was inclined toward the latter. Men who felt they needed to project strength brought men with them. Men who knew they had it came by themselves. Holloway was somewhere around 50, with the weathered good looks of a man who had spent enough time outdoors to look capable and enough time indoors to look civilized. He had a silver watch chain across his vest and boots that had been expensive once and were still expensive now. He dismounted without hurrying and tied his horse at the post and came toward the porch where Caleb was waiting with his arms at his sides. "Whitaker." He extended his hand. Caleb shook it. "Holloway." "Nice afternoon." "It'll do." Holloway looked around the ranch with the same calculating expression that his man Dex had used, but more refined, the expression of a man who didn't have to be obvious about it. His eyes went to the north pasture, where the reservoir site was visible as a break in the flat ground, surrounded now by the wooden frame they'd started building for the eventual cistern structure. "I hear the project's coming along," Holloway said. "Slow," Caleb said. Same word Eliza had used. It felt right. Holloway's eyes came back to him. "I'll come to the point because I think you're a man who prefers that." "I do." "My offer from last spring, I'm prepared to increase it." He named a number that was, Caleb had to admit, significant. Enough to pay the debt in Abilene. Enough to buy decent land somewhere else. Land without a failing well, without drought damage, without 3 sections of fence down. Enough to start over somewhere cleaner. Caleb looked at him for a moment. "What's your interest in this particular land?" Holloway smiled. It was a pleasant smile. "Water rights, you know that. The aquifer under the valley isn't infinite, and whoever controls the access points controls the valley. That's just geography." "And if the reservoir works, then my interest increases." Holloway said it simply, without embarrassment. He was a man who respected the direct acknowledgement of self-interest in a way that Caleb found almost refreshing if it hadn't been directed at him. "But I'm making this offer now before you've sunk more work into the project, as a gesture of goodwill." "As a gesture of goodwill." "Yes." Caleb looked past Holloway's shoulder to where Thomas had appeared at the corner of the barn, watching the visitor with those serious eyes. The boy didn't move, just watched. "I've said no twice," Caleb said. "The answer's the same." Holloway didn't react. He had the patience of a man who had been told no before and understood it as a negotiating position rather than a final answer. "Can I ask why?" Caleb thought about it. He could have said the land was his father's, which it wasn't. He'd bought it fair in '84. He could have said it had history, which it did, though most of the history was hard. Instead, he said the true thing, "Because it's home, and I'm not interested in a new one." Holloway looked at him for a long moment. Then his eyes went, deliberately, to the spot where Thomas was standing, and then, just as deliberately, back to Caleb. "A man in your situation," Holloway said carefully, "might find that his circumstances are more complicated than he realizes." The temperature of the conversation dropped several degrees. "What situation is that?" Caleb said. Holloway's expression didn't change. "A struggling ranch, a woman with no legal standing here, a child with no name in this county." He paused. "I'm not suggesting anything improper. I'm simply observing that security has different meanings in different circumstances." Caleb looked at him steadily. His hands were very still at his sides. "I think we're done here." Holloway nodded pleasantly, as if they'd concluded an ordinary business discussion. He untied his horse with the ease of a man who had gotten what he came for, even if it wasn't a yes. He had come to plant something, Caleb understood. Not to buy the ranch today, to make Caleb think about the things he stood to lose, to introduce the idea that Eliza and Thomas were vulnerabilities rather than whatever it was they were becoming. He watched Holloway ride back down the trail until the gray horse disappeared behind the tree line. Thomas came across the yard. "Who was that?" "A man who wants something I have." "What does he want?" "The land." Thomas looked at the trail where the gray horse had gone. Are you going to give it to him? No. The boy considered this. Good, he said, with a firmness that was startling in someone his size. Then he went back to whatever he had been doing before, because he was 5 and the adult world was interesting, but not as interesting as the colt. And Caleb stood in the yard for another minute, looking at nothing in particular, and feeling the weight of what Holloway had just done settle into the afternoon like something cold. That evening he told Eliza. He told her all of it, including the part about the child with no name in this county, and he watched her face while he did. She was quiet for a long time after he finished. Thomas was in bed. The lamp on the table threw a warm circle that didn't reach the corners of the room. Outside, a coyote made its argument to the moon, and then went silent. He's right, Eliza said finally, about the legal standing. He's using it as a lever. Yes, but it's still true. She looked at the lamp. If something happened to you, if the bank took the land, if there was a legal dispute, Thomas and I would have nothing. No claim here. We'd be back where we started. Caleb didn't answer. He had thought about this. He had been thinking about it in one form or another since the day he'd brought them back from the station, and he had been careful not to think about it too directly, because directly was where it got complicated. I'm not suggesting anything, Eliza said quickly. She had the tone of a woman who did not want to be misunderstood. I'm not asking for anything. I'm just saying that he's identified a real thing. I know. What are you going to do? Caleb looked at the lamp for a moment. Keep digging, he said. Finish the reservoir. Make this place worth something he can't just buy. Eliza looked at him. That's not an answer to the legal problem. No, it's not. She nodded slowly. She folded her hands on the table in the careful way she had, the way that meant she was holding something in. Then she said, I want you to know, whatever happens, that Thomas and I being here it's been good. Whatever happens. It was a strange sentence. It was careful and honest, and it left a great deal out, which was probably right because they were two people who had known each other for less than 3 weeks, and the things they were not saying to each other were becoming as significant as the things they were. Caleb understood this. He understood it the way you understand something that you're not yet ready to look at directly. It's been good, he agreed. Whatever happens. They sat in the lamplight for another while, not saying anything, and the coyote started up again outside, and Thomas made a small sound in his sleep from the back room that was almost a word and then wasn't. The reservoir hit full water depth on a Thursday. Caleb was alone when it happened. Eliza had taken Thomas into town for supplies, and he had been working on the western wall of the cistern structure when his boot went through the clay bottom into something soft and dark and wet, and he stood there in the hole looking down at the dark water spreading slowly around his feet. He didn't say anything. There was no one to say anything to. He stood there for a long time with water soaking through his boot and his hands hanging at his sides, and he felt something move through him that was too large and too complicated to name, so he didn't try. He just stood there and let it move through him and looked at the water and thought, without forming it into a real thought, it's real. It's actually real. When Eliza and Thomas came back that afternoon, he met them in the yard. Thomas was talking about something he'd seen in the feed store window, a saddle with silver buckles, which he described in passionate detail, and then he looked at Caleb's face and stopped talking mid-sentence. What happened? The boy said. Caleb looked at him, then at Eliza. I want to show you something, he said. He led them to the north pasture. He had not been back since he'd found the water. He'd spent the intervening hours repairing the fence section on the north side, doing something physical to use up the feeling. And when they reached the edge and looked down into the reservoir hole, the water had risen another 2 inches. Dark, real water. Not a seep, not a trick. Water. Thomas dropped to his knees at the edge and looked down with enormous eyes. It worked, he breathed. It worked, Caleb said. He looked at Eliza. She was looking at the water with an expression he hadn't seen on her before. Not the careful, contained look she usually wore, not the working look, not the assembling a solution look. Just something open and unguarded and real, and her eyes were bright in a way that wasn't quite tears but was in the neighborhood. She looked up and found him already watching her. Neither of them said anything. The moment was already saying something, and adding words to it would have made it smaller. Thomas said, Can I touch it? And the moment broke into something more ordinary and immediate, and Caleb said yes, carefully, and the boy reached down and pressed his fingertips to the dark surface of the water, and then held up his hand to show them both the wetness, grinning now, the first full grin Caleb had seen from him. "It's cold," Thomas announced. "Good," Eliza said, and her voice was slightly unsteady. "Cold means it's deep." They told no one about the water for 4 more days. This was Eliza's idea, not deception, she said. They weren't deceiving anyone. They just weren't announcing it. They needed time to understand what they had before other people started having opinions about it. Caleb agreed, though he understood that the town would find out. News in Harlan Creek found its own way out eventually, like water through an imperfect dam. The question was whether they'd have the structure sound enough before it did. They used those 4 days well. Caleb built the first cistern wall. Eliza designed the channel system using a drawing she made on the back of an old supply list, a series of ditches that would direct rainfall and roof runoff toward the reservoir, increasing its capacity beyond just the natural spring they'd uncovered. Her drawings were precise and practical, and Caleb looked at them for a long time before he said anything. "Where did you learn to think like this?" She looked up from the drawing. "My father. He was an engineer before the farm. Railroad survey work." She paused. "He taught me to think about how things move. Water, mainly. He always said if you understand where water wants to go, you understand half of everything." It was the most she had said about her past in the 3 weeks he had known her. He waited to see if there was more. There wasn't. She went back to the drawing. And he understood that this was the pace at which she would offer things, and that pushing would get him nowhere useful. But later that evening he found Thomas in the barn, talking to the colt through the stall gate in the low, serious voice the boy used when he thought no one was listening. "My grandpa was an engineer," Thomas was telling the colt. "He built things. Mama says I'm like him because I look at things hard." The colt shifted its weight and blinked. Thomas appeared to take this as encouragement. "I don't remember him. He died before I was old enough to." He paused. "But I think he would have liked it here, because of the water." Caleb stood very still at the barn door. Thomas hadn't heard him. He went on talking to the colt in that low voice about the water and the reservoir and the silver buckle saddle in the feed store window, and Caleb stood in the doorway listening to a 5-year-old's private inventory of the world and felt something in his chest go tight and then slowly, painfully ease. He had not loved anything without fear since his wife died. He had not let himself. Fear was the price of caring, and he had decided at some point, not consciously, not in words, but in the accumulated weight of 3 years of choices, that the price was too high. I was starting to think he had been wrong about that. He didn't go into the barn. He went back to the house, and he sat at the kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee, and he thought about the kind of wrong that is also, underneath, a kind of door. The news about the water broke on a Friday. It broke through the Ogle dry goods, specifically through a passing comment Caleb made when he came in for lumber nails, specifically because he was tired and not as careful as he'd intended to be. And Martha Ogle had a gift for extracting information from people who thought they weren't giving any. By Saturday afternoon, Dex was back on the Broken Spur Trail. This time, he didn't have an envelope. "Mr. Holloway would like to discuss a revised offer," Dex said. He was not bothering with pleasantness today. "He says the terms have changed given the new circumstances." "Tell him I'll consider it," Caleb said. Dex looked at him flatly. "He'd prefer a commitment to meet." "Tell him I'll consider a meeting." A long pause. Something in Dex's expression shifted. Not quite a threat, but the posture of a threat, the shape it would make if it leaned forward. "Mr. Holloway isn't accustomed to being deferred." "I expect not." Caleb met his eyes. "But it's my land and my time, and I'll decide when I have both available." Dex sat on his horse for one more long moment, and then he turned and went back down the trail without another word. Caleb watched him go. He did not feel what he had felt the first time Dex came, the low, careful dread of a man with nothing to fight back with. He felt something different now, cleaner, the feeling of a man who has something worth protecting and knows it. He turned back to the house, where through the kitchen window he could see Eliza at the table going over the channel drawings again, adjusting something with the stub of a pencil, frowning at the paper in the focused way she had when she was solving rather than worrying. Thomas was visible at the edge of his vision, near the barn, doing something that involved the colt and a piece of rope, and the kind of optimistic ambition that 5-year-olds brought to all projects regardless of feasibility. The late afternoon light was the particular gold that Texas managed in the hour before dark, the kind that made even struggling things look like they might make it. Caleb stood in the yard and looked at his ranch. 3 weeks ago it had been a place that was dying. The well still wasn't right, the cattle were still thin. The debt to Abilene hadn't disappeared. There were still 3 sections of fence down on the south pasture and a list of repairs that was longer than his patience. But the reservoir was real, and the water was real, and the woman in his kitchen had drawn a channel system that might, if the rains came, if the structure held, if a dozen other things went right, give this land a future it didn't have a month ago. And the boy at the barn was talking to a colt about rope. Grant Holloway wanted this land. He would keep wanting it, and the wanting would not stay polite forever. Caleb understood that. He had enough experience with men like Holloway to know that the pleasant negotiator and the unpleasant version were the same person, and the switch between them was just a matter of what they thought they could get away with. What Caleb had that he hadn't had before was something he was still learning to name. He went inside. The kitchen was warm from the stove. Eliza looked up from her drawings and said, "Dex again?" And he said yes, and she said, "Revised offer?" And he said he assumed so, and she nodded once and looked back at the drawings. "The East Channel," she said, tapping the paper. He did not open it at the door. "Mr. Holloway requests a response within the week," Fitch said. "Mr. Holloway can request what he likes." Caleb tucked the envelope under his arm. "I'll respond when I'm ready." Fitch's courtesy thinned slightly at the edges. "The offer has a deadline, Mr. Whitaker. After the 14th, the terms revert to the previous figure." "Then they revert." Caleb looked at him evenly. "Was there anything else?" There wasn't. Fitch rode back down the trail with the stiff posture of a man who had not gotten the reaction he'd prepared for, and Caleb went inside and set the envelope on the kitchen table and looked at it for a moment before he opened it. The number inside was larger than the last one, considerably larger. Large enough that Caleb sat down in the kitchen chair and read it twice, not because he hadn't understood it, but because he wanted to be sure his understanding wasn't distorted by how much he needed to not be tempted by it. He was tempted. He was not going to pretend otherwise, even inside his own head, because he was a man who owed money in Abilene and had thin cattle and a fence that still needed 4 sections repaired and a well that was only partially solved and a debt load that the reservoir had improved but not erased. The number on that paper would clear all of it, would clear it and leave enough over to start somewhere new without the weight of this particular failure history dragging at every decision. He sat with that for a while. Then he folded the letter back into its envelope and put it in the drawer under the window, the one that stuck and required a specific angle to open, and he went back outside to where he had been reinforcing the east wall of the cistern because the work was still there and it didn't care about envelopes. He didn't tell Eliza about the new number that evening. He told himself it was because it wasn't the right moment, but the truth was more complicated than that. The truth was that he didn't entirely trust himself to say the number out loud, without some part of his face giving away how much it had landed on him, and he didn't want Eliza to see that. He didn't want her to think, even for a moment, that he was weighing them against a sum of money, even if, in some small and shameful corner of his mind, he had been. He told her the next morning. He did it at breakfast, before the work started, because waiting until evening felt like cowardice, and he had made a private rule in his life that he would not be a coward about things that mattered. He put the envelope on the table between them. He didn't say anything about the night before. She looked at the envelope and then at him, and he said, "Holloway sent a revised offer. The number is considerably higher than the last one." She picked up the envelope and read the letter without expression. Thomas was eating cornmeal at the end of the table with the focused inefficiency of a 5-year-old who had found an interesting pattern in the grain of the table wood. He was not paying attention to them. He was paying complete attention to them. Eliza set the letter down. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to say no." She looked at him. "Because of the land?" "Yes." A pause. "Because of us?" The question sat in the air between them with the particular weight of questions that have been thought for a while before being asked. Caleb looked at the letter on the table. He was not a man who was easy with his interior, and this was the kind of moment that required a man to be easy with it or else say something insufficient, and he didn't want to say something insufficient. "Both," he said. Eliza looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at the letter. He's not going to stop. No. When the polite offers stop working, men like him don't go away. They just change methods. I know. She folded the letter back into the envelope with the precise, careful movement she used when she was thinking hard about something else. Then we need to be ready for that. Thomas looked up from his cornmeal. Ready for what? For hard weather, Eliza said, without missing a beat. Thomas accepted this with the equanimity of a child who has learned that adults have separate conversations happening underneath the ones he can hear. He went back to his cornmeal and his table-grain study, and Caleb looked across at Eliza and she looked back at him, and the understanding between them was the kind that doesn't require the rest of the sentence. The hard weather came sooner than either of them had expected, and it did not come in the form Caleb had anticipated. It came through Roy Stokes. Roy Stokes was a small rancher about 2 miles south of the Broken Spur, a nervous, resentful man in his 40s who had been slowly losing ground to drought and debt for years, and had developed, in the way that desperate men sometimes do, a talent for directing his frustration at everyone except the actual source of it. Caleb had never particularly liked him. He had never particularly disliked him either. He had simply understood him as a man whose fear had curdled into a kind of permanent suspicion of anyone who seemed to be doing better. Roy Stokes had apparently had a conversation with Grant Holloway. Caleb found this out from the sheriff, Archibald Tull, who came to the Broken Spur on a Tuesday morning looking uncomfortable in the particular way of a man who is delivering a message he doesn't believe in but has an obligation to deliver anyway. Roy Stokes has filed a water rights complaint, Tull said. He was standing on the porch, hat in his hands, turning it slowly at the brim. Claims your reservoir project is diverting subsurface water from his land. Caleb stared at him. Roy Stokes' land is 2 miles south and 30 feet higher in elevation than my north pasture. Water doesn't run uphill, Arch. I know that. Then, I know that, Tull said again, slower. I'm telling you what was filed, not what I believe. He looked at his hat. The county water adjudicator will need to inspect the site. That's just procedure. The complaint triggers the inspection regardless of its merit. Caleb understood. Understood all of it. The complaint was not Roy Stokes' idea, and it was not about Roy Stokes' water rights, and the adjudicator's inspection would find nothing because there was nothing to find, but the process would take time and create uncertainty and make it known publicly that the Whitaker Ranch's water project was legally contested, even by a contest that had no legs. It was a move to muddy the water, not the actual water, the political kind, and slow down everything that was happening on the Broken Spur before it became too established to challenge. Who's the adjudicator? Caleb said. Tull was quiet for just a half-second too long. Fellow named Prescott. He's out of the county seat. Is he Holloway's man? I don't know that he's anyone's man. Tull looked at him steadily. I do know that Holloway has interests in the county seat. Caleb nodded slowly. He looked past Tull at the north pasture, where the reservoir sat quiet in the morning light, the cistern walls now almost to full height. 4 weeks of work, 4 weeks of blisters and sore backs, and Thomas moving rocks, and Eliza measuring angles and the two of them digging in the blue morning light before the day got hot. When is the inspection? 2 weeks, 3rd Tuesday of the month. Caleb looked back at Tull. The sheriff was a decent man. Not a brave man, perhaps. Not a man who would stake himself against Holloway's influence without very good reason, but decent in the baseline way that mattered. He had come out here himself rather than sending a deputy. He had told Caleb what he needed to read between the lines. Thanks for coming yourself, Caleb said. Tull nodded. He put his hat back on. I'll tell you something, and you can do with it what you like. He stepped off the porch. A water adjudicator can be challenged. If you have documentation, surveys, drawings, measurements, that demonstrates the hydrology clearly, a challenged adjudicator has to account for that in his report. He can't just write whatever he wants if there's a clear counter record. He mounted his horse. That's just how the process works. He rode away. Caleb stood on the porch for a long time after the dust from Tull's horse settled. Then he went inside and found Eliza at the table with her drawings spread out. She had been refining the channel system, adding measurements she had taken over the past week, and he told her what Tull had said. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she looked at the drawings on the table. How precise are these? He asked. Precise enough for me, she said. Not precise enough for a legal challenge. She was already pulling the drawings toward her, looking at them with narrowed eyes. I need survey measurements. Exact elevations. The hydrology has to be demonstrable on paper, not just obvious to anyone standing in the north pasture. Can you do that? She looked at him with a faint expression that was almost, not quite, impatience. My father surveyed railroad routes for 15 years. I used to do the measurements with him before I was old enough for school. She picked up her pencil. Yes, I can do that. He watched her begin working, not the tentative beginning of someone figuring out where to start, but the immediate, purposeful beginning of someone who already knew exactly what they were doing. And he felt something that was partly admiration and partly a strange species of relief, the kind that comes when you realize that the problem you're facing has more resources aimed at it than you initially counted. Eliza. She looked up. I'm glad you're here. She looked at him for a moment. Something moved in her face that she didn't try to control, which was unusual for her. Then she looked back at her drawings. Get me a proper measuring rope, she said, and stakes. I need to mark the elevation points before the light changes. What? They spent 3 days on the survey. Eliza worked with a rigor that Caleb found slightly humbling, not because he was incompetent, but because she had a quality of focused precision that most people lost somewhere in childhood, that ability to hold a complicated system entirely in the mind while checking each individual component against the whole. She measured elevations at 16 points across the north pasture and the boundary with Roy Stokes's land. She calculated the angle and gradient of the natural subsurface slope. She documented the depth and location of the spring they'd uncovered. She drew it all out in a series of detailed diagrams that showed, with the kind of clarity that required no special expertise to understand, that the water under the Broken Spur's north pasture ran away from Roy Stokes's land, not toward it. That his complaint was not just wrong, but physically impossible. Could a trained adjudicator challenge this? Caleb asked, looking at the finished documents. A dishonest one could try, Eliza said, but he'd have to explain why the basic hydrology of the valley doesn't work the way it works. He'd have to produce countermeasurements, and those measurements would have to come from somewhere. She set down her pencil. If Prescott is Holloway's man, he'll try to drag the process out, request additional documentation, schedule a second inspection, find procedural objections. He won't be able to simply rule against us with this on the record. So we delay his delay. We make it expensive for him to be dishonest. She looked at the documents. It's not the same as winning, but it might be enough. Thomas had been sitting at the end of the table through most of this conversation, doing what he always did when the adults were discussing serious things, appearing to be occupied with something else while absorbing everything with the quiet intensity of a child who understood that the things happening around him would shape the life he lived. He had been drawing on a scrap of paper with a piece of charcoal. He pushed the paper toward Caleb without comment. It was a drawing of the ranch. Rough, the way a 5-year-old's drawings are rough, but recognizable, and the house, the barn, the north pasture, a large circle that was clearly meant to be the reservoir. In the corner, 3 stick figures, one tall, one medium, one small. The small one was holding something that was either a horse or a very angular dog. Caleb looked at it for a long moment. That's us, Thomas said, in case it wasn't clear. I can see that. Thomas looked at the drawing with the assessing eye of the artist. I made you too tall, but you're pretty tall. He glanced at Eliza. Mama's the right size. Eliza looked at the drawing and pressed her lips together in the way that meant she was holding something in that she didn't want Thomas to see. She stood up and went to check something on the stove that probably didn't need checking. Caleb folded the drawing carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. Thomas watched this with satisfaction. For keeping? He said. For keeping, Caleb confirmed. Us. The trouble that Grant Holloway had been building toward came on a night that gave no warning. Caleb woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of something wrong. He could not have said, in the first seconds of waking, what it was. Not a specific sound, more an absence of the right sounds and a presence of a wrong one. He lay still for 2 seconds, listening. The cattle were restless. Not the ordinary night restlessness of animals settling, but the particular agitation that meant something was disturbing them. He was out of bed and pulling on his boots before he was fully awake. He took his rifle from the wall, a habit, not a decision, and went out the back door into the night air that was cool now, in the way that September had started to make it cool after the brutal summer. The stars were dense overhead. The cattle were definitely moving in the north pasture, which was wrong because the north pasture gate was latched, and they should have been standing. He heard the sound then. Not cattle, and not coyotes, and not wind, shovels. The sound of metal striking earth, coming from the north pasture, coming from the direction of the reservoir. He went at a run. There were two of them. He saw their shapes against the night sky before they saw him. Two men with shovels working at the eastern wall of the cistern, the wall that controlled the water flow into the channel system. They had already taken down 3 feet of the wall. Another hour, and they would have collapsed enough of the structure to drain the reservoir entirely, flooding the channel and washing out the work they had done on the eastern gradient. It would have taken weeks to rebuild. Weeks during which the water adjudicator would have nothing to adjudicate, because there would be nothing functioning to examine. Caleb stopped at the fence line. He did not rush forward. He was alone and it was dark and there were 2 of them and he had a rifle, but he was not a man who led with a rifle if there was another option. "Step back from the wall," he said. His voice in the night silence was very clear. Both men stopped. They turned. In the starlight he could see that they had covered their faces with cloth, which told him they were not Roy Stokes. Roy Stokes was too stupid and too frightened to think of that. And they were not random opportunists. They were men who had been sent. One of them held his shovel up slowly, not quite pointing it, not quite surrendering. The other one stayed low and still in the way that someone stays still when they are calculating. "You're on my land," Caleb said. "You've damaged my property. I'm going to ask you one time to put the shovels down and walk back the way you came." The still one moved. He moved fast and sideways, not toward Caleb, toward the corner of the cistern wall where the remaining structure was most vulnerable. And Caleb understood in that half second that the man was not going to fight him. He was going to finish the job, take the consequence of the rifle, because the job was what mattered, and whatever Holloway was paying them was worth the risk of a confrontation. Caleb fired once into the ground 3 feet from the man's boots. The explosion of sound in the night silence was enormous. The cattle broke and ran the length of the north pasture. Both men dropped their shovels. The still one straightened up and put both hands out to his sides. And the message in the posture was clear enough, not worth it. They left. No words, no threats, no anything. They simply walked back across the north pasture toward the fence on the far side, climbed it, and disappeared into the dark on the other side. Caleb stood at the cistern wall with his rifle and listened to the sound of them going, and then to the sound of horses moving at a distance, and then to silence. He lowered the rifle. He stood at the damaged wall for a long time, looking at what they'd taken down. 3 feet. Maybe 4 hours of work to rebuild. Not catastrophic. But it would have been, if he hadn't woken. He became aware that someone was behind him. He turned. Eliza was standing at the edge of the north pasture in her nightclothes with a shawl thrown over her shoulders and a lantern in her hand, and her face in the lantern light was very white and very still. "I heard the shot," she said. "I know, I'm sorry. There wasn't another option." She looked at the damaged wall. She looked at the scattered shovels. She looked at him, at the rifle, at his hands, at his face. "Are you hurt?" she said. "No." She looked at the wall again. When she looked back, the white stillness had shifted into something harder and more focused. Not anger exactly. It was colder than anger. It was the look of a woman who has just fully understood something she had been partly understanding for a while. "He sent them," she said. It was not a question. "I can't prove that." "Caleb." "I can't prove it yet." She stood there for a moment with the lantern and the shawl and the hard, cold look, and then she said, "Thomas is in the house. He's awake. He heard the shot." She paused. "What do I tell him?" It was one of those questions that sits entirely differently than it sounds. She was not asking him what words to use. She was asking him something about what this was, what they were, what she was supposed to be telling her son about the life they were living on this piece of ground. "Tell him the truth," Caleb said. "Tell him someone tried to hurt the ranch, and we stopped them, and we're going to make sure it doesn't happen again." Eliza looked at him steadily. "Are we?" "Yes." She held his gaze for one more moment. Then she turned and went back to the house. Caleb stood at the damaged wall and waited for his heart rate to come down, which took longer than he would have liked. He was not a man who was easily frightened, but fright and him were on speaking terms after something like this. The retrospective fear, The one that arrives after the moment is over and shows you all the ways it could have gone differently. He sat on the edge of the cistern and held the rifle across his knees and let the retrospective fear say what it had to say, and then he set it aside. He thought about what Eliza had said. Are we? Two words that meant, are you certain? Are you committed? Is this land and this life, and whatever is growing between us worth the cost of what Holloway is apparently willing to do? He had said yes without hesitation, and he had meant it without hesitation, and the not hesitating was new. He had hesitated about everything for 3 years. He had held himself at the careful distance of a man who had decided that commitment was the mechanism of loss. Something had changed. I was not entirely sure when, and he was not going to examine it too closely tonight with a damaged wall in front of him and the smell of gunpowder still in the air. But it had changed. He stayed at the reservoir until the sky began to lighten in the east. In the morning, he went to see Archibald Toll. He told the sheriff everything: the 2 men, the shovels, the damaged wall, the horses he'd heard riding away toward the east, which was the direction of Holloway's land. He was precise about it. He was precise in the way that Eliza had been precise with the survey documents, because he had started to understand that precision was not just accuracy, it was armor. Toll listened with his hat in his hands again. He had the expression of a man who believed what he was hearing and was trying to figure out what he could do about it, against what he was allowed to do about it. I can't arrest Holloway for something 2 unidentified men did on your property, Toll said. I know that. I can record the incident. I can note the probable direction of approach and retreat in the official record. He paused. I can make it known that I was informed and that I have concerns. That's something. It's not much. No. Caleb looked at him. But I'm also going to need a notary. I have documents I want recorded with the county today. Toll's eyebrows went up slightly. The survey work. Yes. I want them in the county record before the adjudicator arrives. Public record. Unambiguous. Toll studied him for a moment. Something shifted in the sheriff's expression. Something that was not quite admiration but was in the direction of it. The look of a man recalibrating his estimate of another man. You've been thinking ahead. Someone in my house has. Caleb stood. Can you recommend a notary? The documents went into the county record on a Thursday. Caleb had brought Eliza with him. This was practical. She had created the documents, and the notary had questions about methodology that she answered with the kind of technical fluency that made the notary, a fussy little man named Gunder, visibly reconsider his initial skepticism. By the end of the session, Gunder was treating her with the careful deference of a man who has realized he is dealing with someone who knows more than he does about something he assumed was his exclusive domain. Thomas had come too, because there was no one to leave him with, and because Eliza had said, in a voice that suggested this was the end of the discussion, that she was not going to leave her son alone at the ranch after what had happened at the reservoir wall. Thomas sat in the corner of Gunder's office on a wooden chair with his feet not quite reaching the floor, holding his wooden horse and watching the proceedings with the quiet attention he brought to everything. When Gunder stamped the final document and announced that the survey and water rights documentation for the Whitaker property was now an official matter of county record, Thomas said, "Is that good?" And Gunder said somewhat stiffly, "It is a legal protection, young man." And Thomas nodded as if this confirmed what he had already suspected. On the way back, Eliza was quiet for a long time. Not the contained, careful quiet of someone holding something in. A different quiet. The quiet of someone who has just done something that cost them something and is sitting with the cost. "What is it?" Caleb said. She looked at the trail ahead. The horse moved at its steady pace. "I keep thinking about what Holloway said, about legal standing, about Thomas having no name in this county." Caleb was quiet. "The documents we just filed," she said. "They protect the land, the water rights. They don't—" She stopped, started again. "If Holloway decides to challenge our presence here on other grounds, if he decides to make an issue of the situation, of what I am here, legally, you're a resident of this ranch. As what?" The question landed cleanly and sat there. As what? He had been circling this question for weeks. He had been aware of it the way you are aware of a stone in your boot. Not always consciously, but always present, always slightly altering the way you moved. He did not answer immediately, which was not evasion. It was the instinct of a man who had learned that the wrong version of the right answer was worse than the silence before it. "I'm thinking about that," he said. Eliza looked at him. She had a way of looking at him that did not demand. That was the thing about her. That was one of the things about her, that she made no demands of any kind and never had, and somehow that made him more careful with her than any demand would have. "I'm not asking you for anything," she said quietly. "I know you're not. I want to be clear about that." "Eliza," he looked at her. "I know you're not asking. That's not what I'm thinking about." She held his gaze for a moment. The horse kept moving. Thomas, sitting between them on the saddle with an ease he had now entirely achieved, was apparently asleep, his head tipped slightly forward, the wooden horse held loosely in one hand. "What are you thinking about?" she said. Caleb looked at the trail ahead. The Broken Spurs turnoff was a quarter-mile up, marked by the old cedar post that had been there when he bought the land and would probably be there long after him. He thought about the empty house, about the 3 years of silence, about the lamp on the table and the drawing spread across it, and the smell of cornbread through the kitchen window, and Thomas saying it's cold, that means it's deep, holding up his wet fingertips in the afternoon light. "Whether the right thing," he said carefully, "is also the thing I want. Because sometimes it is. And I spent a long time not believing that was possible." Eliza said nothing, but something in her posture changed, a small shift, barely perceptible, the way a door opens an inch before it opens all the way. They rode the rest of the distance in the quiet that had become, over these weeks, their particular language. The silence between two people who have too much to say and are being careful about the order in which they say it. The night before the adjudicator's inspection, Holloway made his last move in the polite version of this war. He came himself this time. Alone, late afternoon, and he did not tie his horse at the post, which was a choice. Staying mounted meant the conversation had a defined end that was his to control. Caleb came out to the porch. "I know about the county filing," Holloway said. He was not pleasant today. Not unpleasant either. He had moved into a register that was simply direct, stripped of the performance of courtesy. "It was a smart move. Thank you. It complicates things." "That was the idea." Holloway looked at him from the horse. "I want you to know that I don't dislike you, Whitaker. I want to say that clearly. This is not personal." "It became personal," Caleb said, "when you sent men to break down my reservoir wall." A silence. "I don't know what you're referring to." "I think you do." Holloway's jaw tightened slightly, the only crack in the surface. "I'm going to make you one final offer. After the adjudicator's visit, regardless of the outcome, the terms will no longer be available. I want you to understand that." "I understand it." "And you still say no?" "I still say no." Holloway looked at him for a long moment. Something moved in his face. Not anger, or not only anger. Something that was almost, Caleb thought, respect. The frustrated respect of a man who has encountered a limit he did not expect. "The adjudicator arrives at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning," Holloway said. "Make sure your documents are in order." "They are." "Make sure your residents are not on this property during the inspection. It complicates the appearance of the situation." Caleb's hands went very still at his sides. "My residents," he said. "The woman. The boy." "Their names," Caleb said, "are Eliza and Thomas, and they will be exactly where they belong during the inspection, on their ranch." The word there landed between them like something placed there deliberately. Holloway heard it. His eyes sharpened slightly. He looked at Caleb with an expression that was recalculating something. "I see," he said. "Good." Holloway looked at the ranch one more time, the house, the barn, the north pasture, visible beyond, with the look of a man who has just confirmed something he needed to confirm. Then he turned his gray horse and rode back down the trail without another word. Caleb stood on the porch until the hoofbeats faded. Behind him, the door opened. He did not turn. He knew who it was. "How much of that did you hear?" he said. "Enough." Eliza's voice was steady. "He's not going to stop." "No." "The adjudicator tomorrow is going to be a problem, regardless of the documents." "Probably." She came to stand beside him on the porch. Not close, the appropriate distance of two people who had not yet figured out the right distance, but beside him. They looked out at the trail together. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what you said yesterday. On the ride back." Caleb waited. "About whether the right thing is also the thing you want." She looked at her hands on the porch rail. "I've spent the last several years doing the right thing. The careful thing. The safe thing. Coming here was supposed to be the careful thing. A husband, a home, a name for Thomas." She paused. "It didn't work out that way." "No." But something else happened instead. She looked up at the sky, where the evening was settling in the particular way it did here, not fast, not soft, but with a kind of slow deliberateness that he had never seen anywhere else. "I'm not going to pretend I know what it is, or what it should be. I'm not a woman who pretends." Another pause. "But I'm not afraid of it, whatever it is." Caleb looked at her. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the sky with a stillness that was not the contained, careful stillness she usually wore. This was something else. This was the stillness of a woman standing at the edge of something and not stepping back. "Neither am I," he said. She looked at him then. Something passed between them that was very quiet and very large, the kind of thing that doesn't need words because words would make it smaller than it is. Inside, Thomas called from the back room. Something about the colt, or possibly about supper, or both. And Eliza turned toward the door. She paused with her hand on the frame. "Get some sleep," she said. "Tomorrow is going to require everything we have." He nodded. She went inside. Caleb stood on the porch a while longer, looking at the trail and the darkening sky, and the north pasture where the reservoir sat quiet behind its walls, full of real water, documented and recorded and defended. Tomorrow the adjudicator would come, and Holloway's version of things would press against theirs, and the outcome was not certain. He was honest enough with himself to know that nothing about this was certain, that men with Holloway's resources did not lose easily, even when they were wrong. But tonight the ranch was quiet, and the water was real, and there were lights in his windows that had not been there 4 weeks ago, and a boy asleep in the back room who had said, "We," when talking about the work they were doing, just casually, the way you say "we" when it's simply true. Caleb went inside. He sat at the table and looked at the survey documents they had prepared. Eliza's precise measurements, her father's engineering logic translated into this Texas ground. And he thought, whatever comes tomorrow, this is real. What we built is real. What we are to each other is real. Grant Holloway could send adjudicators and legal challenges and men with shovels in the night. But he could not make real things unreal. Caleb put out the lamp and went to bed, and outside the north pasture the reservoir held its water in the dark, patient and full, and entirely without doubt. Prescott arrived at 8 o'clock exactly, which told Caleb something about him before he opened his mouth. Men who arrived exactly on time to inspections were men who understood that punctuality was a form of authority, that showing up at the precise moment you had stipulated demonstrated that you controlled the terms of the encounter. Prescott was a county adjudicator of perhaps 45, with the careful grooming of a man who took his official capacity seriously and the careful eyes of a man who took his own interests more seriously still. He had a young assistant with him who carried a leather satchel and wrote things down. He had no warmth and no coldness either, just a professional neutrality that Caleb recognized immediately as the most dangerous kind of face to read. He shook Caleb's hand at the porch. He nodded to Eliza with the minimal courtesy of a man acknowledging a presence he had not expected and did not know how to categorize. He looked at Thomas briefly and then looked away in the manner of a man to whom children were simply irrelevant to the business at hand. "I'll need to see the site," Prescott said, "and whatever documentation you have." "I have both," Caleb said. He led Prescott and the assistant to the north pasture. Eliza walked with them, which Caleb had not asked her to do, and which Prescott's expression suggested he would have preferred she didn't. Thomas had been left at the house with strict instructions to stay in the yard, which he was almost certainly not following, but that was a problem for later. The reservoir in the morning light looked exactly like what it was. A substantial, carefully constructed water collection system. The cistern walls solid and well mortared. The channel inlets aligned precisely with Eliza's drawn specifications. The water level had risen another inch overnight. Caleb checked it every morning now, with the habitual attention of a man who has learned not to take real things for granted. Prescott walked the perimeter without speaking. His assistant wrote in the satchel notebook. Prescott crouched at the eastern wall. The wall that Holloway's men had damaged, now rebuilt to its original specification and reinforced, and examined the mortar work with an expression that gave nothing away. "This section," he said. "It's newer than the rest." "Repaired," Caleb said. "Vandalism." Prescott looked up. "Vandalism." "Two men came onto the property at night and took down approximately 3 feet of the wall. I reported it to Sheriff Tull. It's in the county record." A pause. The assistant wrote something. Prescott's eyes moved to Eliza, who was standing to Caleb's left with her folder of survey documents held under her arm, and an expression of complete composure that Caleb knew, by now, was costing her something. "Mrs. Prescott started. "Monroe," Eliza said. "The survey documents were filed by you?" "Yes." "Your qualifications?" It was the kind of question designed to diminish before the answer arrived, the assumption embedded in the asking that the answer would be insufficient. Eliza had heard this kind of question before. Caleb could tell by the way she didn't react to it. "My father was a railroad survey engineer," she said. "I apprenticed with him for 8 years before his death. I can provide the methodology for every measurement in those documents if you need it." She held out the folder. "The elevation calculations are on pages 3 and 4. The subsurface hydrology assessment begins on page 7. Prescott took the folder. He opened it. He read in silence for a long time, long enough that his assistant stopped writing and simply waited. And Caleb watched his eyes move across Eliza's precise figures and understood, from the quality of the silence, that whatever Prescott had expected to find in those pages, this was not it. "These are detailed," Prescott said finally. "Yes," Eliza said. "They are." Prescott closed the folder and held it in a way that suggested he was not going to hand it back. "I'll need to conduct my own measurements." "Of course." Eliza reached into her coat pocket and produced a second copy of the documents. Caleb had not known she had made a second copy, but he was not surprised. "You can keep that set." Prescott looked at the second folder she was holding out. Something crossed his face that was not quite discomfort, but was in the neighborhood. The expression of a man who has come prepared for a certain kind of opponent and found a different one. He took the folder. The inspection took 3 hours. Prescott measured things that Eliza had already measured, which was his right and his job, and his figures. When Caleb managed to see the notebook page over the assistant's shoulder, matched hers within a margin that was effectively nothing. He walked the boundary with Roy Stokes's land twice. He examined the subsurface clay layer that Caleb had first struck with his shovel 6 weeks ago. He took water samples from the reservoir and labeled them with the careful tedium of a man building a record. Caleb stayed close, but not crowding. He answered questions directly and without elaboration, because elaboration looked like defensiveness, and he had nothing to be defensive about. Eliza stayed close to Caleb, which was both practical and something else. A quiet statement that they were a unit here, that the ranch and its residents were not separate things to be addressed separately. At one point, Prescott stopped at the northern boundary marker and looked toward the distance where Roy Stokes's land began its slight upward grade. "Mr. Stokes claims the subsurface water flow has been diverted," Prescott said. He said it to the air between them, not specifically to either of them. "Mr. Stokes's land is at a higher elevation," Eliza said. "Page 4 of the document shows the gradient. Water does not flow uphill. Mr. Stokes has a statement from a gentleman named," Prescott consulted his notebook, "Hargrove, a hydrologist." Caleb looked at him. "What kind of hydrologist?" "A consulting one." "Consulting for whom?" Prescott's eyes came to Caleb. "That's not information I have." "I expect it's not." Caleb kept his voice even. "I'd like to know whether this Hargrove has actually visited the property or whether he produced a statement based on submitted information." Prescott was quiet for a moment. "I can look into that. I'd appreciate it." They looked at each other, and the look was very clear on both sides. Caleb was not going to pretend this was a straightforward administrative process, and Prescott now understood that. Whatever Holloway had told him about this being a simple inspection of a contested claim on a struggling ranch with a complicated domestic situation. The domestic situation was a woman with 8 years of survey training and a filed county record that would make any report contradicting it require explicit explanation. The inspection ended at 11 o'clock. Prescott told them the report would be filed within 30 days. He shook Caleb's hand and nodded again at Eliza, and this time the nod had a different quality, marginally more respectful. The automatic recalibration of a man who has updated his assessment during the course of an encounter. He and his assistant rode away in the direction of town. Caleb and Eliza stood in the north pasture until they were gone. 30 days, Caleb said. He'll take the full 30, Eliza said. It gives him room to figure out what he can actually say, given what's on record. Can Holloway pressure him into a bad report? She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she thought about things. He can pressure him, but the documents are public record now. If Prescott writes something that flatly contradicts measurable physical reality, anyone who reads it can see the contradiction. That has its own risk for Prescott. She looked at the reservoir. He'll probably find something, some procedural issue, some technicality, to delay a final ruling. That's the more likely move. Keep it unresolved as long as possible. And in the meantime, we keep building. She turned toward the house. And we figure out the other problem. He knew what she meant. The legal standing problem. The what are you here problem. He had been thinking about it with the focused avoidance of a man who knows he needs to think about something and keeps finding reasons not to get to it directly. He was out of reasons. Thomas had not stayed in the yard. This was not a surprise. What was a surprise was where he had gone. Not to the barn, not to the colt, but to the fence line on the western edge of the property, where he was sitting on the bottom rail looking out at the open ground with the particular stillness of a child who is working through something privately. Caleb found him there at noon. He leaned on the fence beside him and said nothing for a while because Thomas was a boy who did not respond well to being approached too directly. You had to come at him sideways, the way you approached a nervous horse. After a while, Thomas said, "Is the man gone?" "The inspector?" "Yes." "Was he bad?" "Not exactly. He was complicated." Thomas turned this over. "Mama looked scared." "Your mama wasn't scared," Caleb said. "She was serious. There's a difference." Thomas considered this distinction with the focused attention he brought to everything. "My old teacher looked like that when she was scared but didn't want us to know." "Your mama's tougher than most people." "I know." Thomas looked back at the open ground. He still had the wooden horse. He always had the wooden horse. Caleb had begun to understand it, not as a toy exactly, but as a thinking object, something to hold when the world required processing. "Caleb." "Yeah." "Are we going to have to leave?" The question was very quiet and very direct, the way Thomas's most important questions always were, stated without preamble, because he was old enough to know that preamble was sometimes just a way of making the asker feel better and not the asked. Caleb looked at the open ground. "No," he said. "How do you know?" "Because I'm not going to let that happen." Thomas was quiet for a moment. But what if you can't stop it? It was a 5-year-old asking an adult question, and it deserved an adult answer. And the adult answer was, sometimes you can't stop things. Sometimes the world moves in directions you didn't choose, and all your effort and intention isn't enough to hold the line. Caleb had lived that. He knew it the way you know things that have cost you. "Then we figure out the next thing," he said. "Together." Thomas looked at him. "Together?" "Yeah." "Like a family?" Caleb held the boy's gaze. Thomas's dark eyes were completely serious, completely open, waiting for the true answer without flinching from whatever it was going to be. "Like a family," Caleb said. Thomas looked at the wooden horse in his hand. He moved it along the fence rail in his thinking way. Then he said, "I never had one of those. A real one." He paused. "I mean, I had Mama, but it was always just us." "I know." "It's better," Thomas said simply. "This." He hopped off the fence and went back toward the barn with the easy motion of a child who has finished the conversation he needed to have and is now ready to move on to the next thing. Caleb watched him go and stayed at the fence for a while longer. A family, he thought. The word sat differently than it used to. He asked Eliza that evening, not the way he had planned to. He had not, if he was honest, planned to at all. Not tonight. But the day had been what it had been, and Thomas had said what he had said at the fence, and Eliza was at the kitchen table after supper with her hands flat on the wood surface and the particular look of someone who is trying to rest but cannot fully settle, and Caleb sat down across from her and said what he had been not saying for 2 weeks. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to know before I ask it that it's not because of Holloway, and it's not because of the legal standing problem, even though those things are real. It's because I've been thinking about what I said to Thomas this afternoon." She looked at him. "What did you say to him?" "That we were a family." He held her gaze. "And I meant it. And I think you should know that I meant it before I ask." Eliza was very still. "I'm not a smooth man," Caleb said. "I'm not going to pretend this is a simple thing or that I've got it all figured out. I don't. I know this ranch is a struggle, and I know I'm carrying debt, and I know the last month has been—" He stopped, started again. "But I know what I feel, and I've spent 3 years not trusting that, and I'm tired of not trusting it." He looked at his hands on the table. "I'd like you to stay. Not as a resident. Not as a... I'd like you to marry me. If that's something you could want, I understand if it isn't." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the coyote that had become a fixture of their evenings started up in the distance and then thought better of it and stopped. Eliza looked at him for a long time. Not the measuring look, not the assessing, calculating look she used when she was solving a problem. A different look. Something that had put down its guard and was just present. "You are not a smooth man," she said. "No. That proposal was terrible." Something shifted in his chest. "I know. I've heard better proposals from men I had no intention of saying yes to." "Eliza?" "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," she said again, quieter. "Not because of the legal standing, not because of Holloway, because of what you said to Thomas, and because you mean what you say, and because I have been trying very hard not to." She stopped. She was not a woman who lost her composure, and she did not lose it now, but it was close. She pressed her lips together. "I didn't come here expecting this. I came here expecting to be a practical arrangement for a man I'd never met. I wasn't expecting—" She gestured slightly with one hand, a gesture that encompassed the table and the kitchen and the ranch beyond and possibly everything. "Neither was I," Caleb said. "I know." She looked at him steadily. "That's why I said yes." They sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight for a while, not touching. They were still two careful people, and the moment was large enough that neither of them wanted to rush it. And the quiet between them was the best kind of quiet, the kind that is full rather than empty. Thomas appeared in the doorway in his nightshirt. He had the wooden horse. He looked at them both with those serious eyes, and then apparently decided, based on whatever information was available to a 5-year-old reading the room, that something had changed. "What happened?" he said. Caleb looked at Eliza. Eliza looked at Caleb. "We have something to tell you," Eliza said. "Well, they were married 3 weeks later on a Saturday by a justice of the peace named Hollis Brandt, who did it in his front parlor in 12 minutes flat and charged them $2, which was exactly what Caleb had. Martha Ogle and her husband came as witnesses. Martha cried, which she would have denied if anyone mentioned it. Thomas stood beside Caleb and held the ring when it was time for it, with the gravity of someone entrusted with a very significant task. When it was done, Thomas said, "Is it finished?" And Hollis Brandt said yes, it was official, and Thomas nodded and looked at Caleb with an expression that was working toward something. "Can I call you Papa?" he said. The parlor went very quiet. Caleb looked at Thomas. He thought about what to say and could not find anything, so he said the simple and true thing, "Yeah, you can." Thomas nodded, as if this confirmed what he had already decided. Then he gave Caleb back the ring and went to find something to do, because he was 5 and the adult world was significant, but there were also things to investigate. Eliza looked at Caleb. Her eyes were bright in the way they'd been at the reservoir the day the water was real, and he understood that this was the version of her that existed when she let things reach her, fully, without the filter she'd spent years constructing. "Don't make that face," she said quietly. "What face?" "That face." She straightened his collar, which didn't need straightening. "We still have Holloway to deal with, and 30 days minus 3. And the south fence. 3 sections," he said. 4. She stepped back. I counted again. He almost laughed. She was doing what she always did when something mattered too much. Converting it into practicalities, turning toward the next thing that needed doing. He was starting to love that about her, the way you love things that are specifically and irreducibly someone, rather than just good qualities in general. Martha Ogle clapped both her hands on Eliza's shoulders from behind and said, "Let the man breathe. It's his wedding day." And Eliza said, "He can breathe while we fix the fence." And Martha laughed hard enough that her husband looked concerned. The town's response to the marriage was not uniform, but it was mostly decent. People in Harlan Creek had a way of accepting things that had already happened. The philosophical pragmatism of frontier communities, where the cost of sustained conflict over social arrangements was simply too high for people who needed each other to survive. Eliza was now Eliza Whitaker, which gave her a name in the county and a legal standing that Holloway could not touch. And most people understood this even if they didn't say it. A few didn't take it well. The two women from the dry goods who had whispered when Eliza first came to town found new things to whisper about. Roy Stokes, emboldened by his existing complaint and by whatever Holloway was continuing to promise him, made a comment at the feed store that Caleb did not hear directly but heard about through the reliable circuit of frontier gossip. The comment had to do with mail-order brides and their sons, and a man's judgment when he was lonely enough. Caleb heard this on a Tuesday. He went to the feed store on Wednesday. He did not go looking for a confrontation. He went because he needed wire, and the feed store had wire, and he was not going to change his route through town because Roy Stokes was afraid of his own shadow and had let that fear be pointed at Caleb's family. He found Roy at the counter and said his name, and Roy turned with the expression of a man who knows what's coming. "I'm not going to tell you what you can and can't say," Caleb said quietly. "That's not my business. But I'm going to tell you once that my wife and son are not a topic I'm going to be patient about." He held Roy's gaze. "We clear?" Roy Stokes was a small man in most of the ways that mattered, but he was not entirely without dignity, and he nodded without looking away, which Caleb respected enough to leave it there. He got his wire and left. On the way out, the baker's wife, Mrs. Engel, who had given Thomas the cinnamon roll on that first difficult Saturday, touched his arm as he passed her shop. "Congratulations," she said. "I heard about the marriage. Your wife is a good woman." "She is," Caleb said, "and the boy is a fine boy." She paused. "I hope things settle down for you." "They will," he said. He was not entirely certain of this, but it felt true when he said it, which was something. Prescott's report arrived on day 28. Not day 30, day 28, which meant he had come to a conclusion 2 days early, which Eliza said meant one of two things. Either the hydrology was so clear that there was nothing to reasonably contest, or Holloway had pushed for a faster resolution because waiting longer served no purpose. They read it at the kitchen table. Thomas was in bed. The lamp was between them and the document was 6 pages, typed in the careful language of county officialdom. The report found no evidence of subsurface water diversion from the Stokes property. The elevation data and hydrology documentation, it noted, demonstrated that the natural water flow in the area ran in the opposite direction from that alleged in the complaint. The complaint filed by Roy Stokes was determined to be without factual basis. The reservoir and cistern project was found to be in compliance with county water regulations. The Whitaker Ranch's water rights to the subsurface spring were confirmed. Caleb read the conclusion twice. Then he set the document on the table. Eliza had finished reading a moment before him. She sat with her hands flat on the table in her resting way. "He ruled for us," Caleb said. "Yes." "I didn't think he would." "I wasn't sure either." She looked at the document. The county record made it too expensive to rule otherwise. If he'd written something contradicting measurements that are physically verifiable and publicly filed, anyone could have challenged the report and his methodology. It wasn't worth it to him. "Holloway's not going to accept this." "No," she agreed. "He's going to try something else." But that evening was not the time to worry about what something else looked like. That evening, Caleb folded the report and put it in the drawer that stuck. Beside the drawer, with Holloway's last letter, a strange pair of documents to keep together. And he and Eliza sat on the porch in the September air that had gone cool enough now to make it comfortable. She leaned against the post and he sat in the chair, and the quiet between them was easy, the way it had gotten easy over these weeks. "My father would have liked this place," she said. It was the most she had said about her father unprompted. He liked problems with physical solutions, water problems, gradient problems, things you could measure and figure out. "Tell me about him," Caleb said. She was quiet for a moment, not reluctant, thinking about where to start. He was a serious man, she said, not cold, just precise. He believed that if you understood a thing correctly, you could deal with it, anything. That lack of understanding was the root of most human error. She looked at the dark pasture. He was mostly right about that. Mostly? He didn't understand my mother well enough. She left when I was 12. A pause. He understood that she'd gone. He never understood why. Caleb said nothing. He waited. He raised me after that, Eliza said. Took me on survey work because there was no one to leave me with, and then kept taking me because it turned out I was good at it. Something warm moved through her voice. He never said that. He just kept taking me. She looked at her hands. He died of fever when Thomas was 2. Thomas's father was not a man who stayed. My father was the last of my family. I'm sorry, Caleb said. It's all right. She said it in the way that meant it was not entirely all right, but had been lived with long enough to become manageable. I learned from him that you look at things as they are, not as you wish they were. That you measure before you decide. She paused. I measured this place when I arrived. I measured you. He looked at her. And? And the place had good bones, she said. And you had sad eyes and a good heart and a horse that bites fence posts when he's bored. She glanced at him sideways. I thought there might be something worth staying for. Might be, he said. I've updated my assessment. She looked back at the dark. There is. He reached across and put his hand over hers on the porch rail. She turned her hand and held his. They sat like that for a while, not talking, while the evening settled around them, and somewhere in the north pasture the reservoir held its water in the dark, and somewhere past the tree line Holloway's light still burned, and tomorrow would bring whatever tomorrow brought. The town meeting was Toll's idea. He came to the ranch 4 days after the adjudicator's report and told Caleb that there were enough people in Harlan Creek who were tired of what Holloway had been doing, not just with the Whitaker Ranch, but with the half-dozen other properties he had pressured and bought in the last 2 years, that they might be willing to say so publicly if they had a forum to do it in. A town meeting, Caleb said. Harlan Creek has a public meeting mechanism, Toll said. Town charter. Any resident can call a meeting to raise matters of community concern. If the water rights situation and Holloway's conduct, the business with the vandalism, the water complaint, is raised as a community concern, it becomes public record. Holloway will know it's coming. Yes, but that's not necessarily a disadvantage. Toll looked at him steadily. It forces him to either show up and defend himself publicly or not show up and look like he's avoiding it. Neither is comfortable for a man who depends on his standing in this county. Caleb thought about it. He thought about it with Eliza that evening, and she had questions, good ones, the precise kind, about what the meeting could and couldn't accomplish, what the risks were, what it meant if Holloway showed up with lawyers versus if he showed up alone versus if he sent someone else. Can it actually stop him? She asked. Not by itself, Caleb said, but Toll thinks it can change the cost calculation. Right now, Holloway is operating like nobody else has an interest in what he's doing. If the community puts itself on record as having an interest, it's harder to act like a private matter. She nodded slowly. Who would speak? Toll says there are people willing, the Engel family. A few of the farmers he's pressured. Martha Ogle. He paused. He says you should speak too. Eliza looked at him. Me. You're the one who built the reservoir documentation. You're the one who understood what was happening with the water rights before I did. You know more about what Holloway was actually trying to do than anyone. She was quiet for a long time. He could see the internal calculation. The woman who had arrived as a stranger in this town and spent weeks earning her way to being something other than a stranger, weighing the exposure of standing up publicly against the protection that public standing could provide. If I speak, she said, people will have opinions about it. People already have opinions about you. Having opinions about me quietly in the dry goods is different from me giving them a public reason to have opinions loudly. Yes, he agreed, but it's also different from you being a woman who stood up and told the truth when it mattered. She looked at him for a long time. Something behind her eyes was moving through the calculation and coming out the other side. When is the meeting? 2 Saturdays from now. She nodded once. All right. The Saturday of the town meeting was overcast in the particular way that West Texas went overcast in early October. Not the dramatic cloud building of summer storms, but a low gray lid that made the light flat and made distances look closer than they were. The Harlan Creek Meeting Hall was a long room above the feed store that smelled of cedar and old tobacco and held about 80 people when it was full. It was full today. Caleb had not expected that. He had expected a reasonable turnout, the people Tull had specifically spoken to, and perhaps a few others who had heard through the town's reliable gossip channels. Instead, the room was dense with bodies, people standing at the back and along the walls, and the sound of many separate conversations that died down when Tull called the meeting to order. Grant Holloway was there. He was seated near the front, not hiding, with Aldous Fitch beside him, and the posture of a man who has decided that attending is less dangerous than not attending. He looked at Caleb when Caleb came in, a steady, assessing look that acknowledged the situation without conceding anything. Roy Stokes was there too, in the middle of the room, looking like a man who deeply wished he had not let himself be used for someone else's purposes, and was now going to have to sit with the consequences. Thomas was not there. Martha Ogle had taken him to her house for the afternoon, which Thomas had accepted with the pragmatic grace of a child who knew when adults needed to do things without him. Tull opened formally. Water rights in the county, a complaint filed and adjudicated, a pattern of property acquisition and pressure that had affected multiple families in the valley. He was careful with his language. He named no one at first. He laid out the situation like a map, letting people orient before he asked them to say anything. Then he opened the floor. The baker, Mr. Engel, spoke first. He had sold a small piece of his northern property to Holloway 2 years ago under what he described as considerable pressure, implied threats about his flour supply contracts, which Holloway's purchasing agent apparently controlled. He said it quietly and without drama, the way a man recounts something he is not proud of having allowed to happen. The Corrigan family, 3 brothers who ran cattle north of Holloway's main spread, told a similar story. Water access, implied threats, a sale that felt less like a transaction and more like an extraction. Martha Ogle stood up and said, in her direct and unimprovable way, that she had been watching Grant Holloway operate in this county for 6 years, and it was time for the community to have a clear look at the pattern of what he'd been doing. And she said this while looking directly at Holloway, who looked back at her with the expression of a man who had underestimated her and was revising that estimate now. Then Tull asked Caleb. Caleb was not by nature a public speaker. He stood up and was aware of the room in the uncomfortable way of someone who would prefer to be anywhere else. And he told the story plainly. The offer, the refusals, the men with shovels in the night, the water complaint, the adjudicator's report. He did not editorialize. He let the sequence speak for itself, because the sequence was damning enough without ornamentation. Holloway's lawyer, not Fitch, a different man who must have been brought specifically for today, rose during a pause and said that his client denied the allegations regarding the reservoir vandalism, and that the water complaint had been a legitimate action pursued through proper legal channels. Caleb looked at him. The adjudicator found the complaint had no factual basis. The adjudicator's finding is a matter of record, the lawyer said smoothly, as is the fact that the complaint was a legitimate legal instrument used by a legitimate party. Roy Stokes, Caleb said, and looked at Roy, who looked at the floor. The room made a sound that was not quite a response, but was a collective impression of one. Then Eliza stood up. The room went quiet in a particular way. The way rooms go quiet when someone unexpected stands up, when the calculation of who in the room has something to say is suddenly revised. Eliza stood with her hands at her sides and her posture straight, and her voice, when she spoke, was clear and even. She told them about the survey, about the hydrology, about what a water rights seizure of the Whitaker property would have meant for the valley, not just for one ranch, but for the surrounding properties, because the Broken Spurs aquifer was connected to the broader subsurface water system, and controlling it meant controlling access for a wider range of land than Holloway had publicly represented. She had the documents. She had brought copies. She walked through the technical details with the concise clarity of someone who has explained complicated things to skeptical audiences before, and knows that the best way to hold a room is not to perform expertise, but to simply be competent, visibly, in front of people who can recognize it. The room listened, truly listened, in the way that came from people recognizing something real. When she finished, the silence lasted a beat longer than expected. Holloway's lawyer started to say something. Martha Ogle said, loudly and without apology, "Sit down, I'm not done listening." And the lawyer sat down, and the room laughed. Not mean laughter, the laughter of recognition, of a community deciding what it thought. Toll asked if anyone else had something to say. A man from the back, Caleb didn't know him well, a rancher named Bryce from the eastern edge of the valley, said he'd been approached by Holloway's people last spring about his water rights. He'd said no. He'd have been told, very carefully and indirectly, that water access was a variable thing in drought years. He'd been thinking about that conversation for 6 months and hadn't said anything because he wasn't sure who to say it to. "This seems like the place," he said. 3 more people spoke in the next 15 minutes. 3 more versions of the same pattern, wearing slightly different details. Holloway remained seated through all of it. His face was controlled and his posture was correct, and Caleb watched him with the careful attention of a man trying to read what was happening behind a still surface. What he saw, or thought he saw, because he was not a man who claimed certainty about the inner workings of other men, was a calculation being revised, not defeat. Holloway was not the kind of man who experienced defeat easily, but something was shifting in his understanding of the cost of what he had been doing and what it would cost to continue. After the last person spoke, Tull asked Holloway if he wanted to address the room. Holloway stood. I was, even now, a composed and formidable presence, and Caleb gave him that. He said that he had engaged in legal and legitimate business practices throughout his time in Harlan Creek, that he was sorry if any of his neighbors had felt pressure in their dealings with him, that he valued his standing in this community and would be more attentive going forward to how his business interests were perceived by those around him. It was a careful statement. It gave up nothing directly and implied something significant indirectly, and the room received it with the skepticism of people who had just heard the preceding hour. But it was also, Caleb understood, a form of retreat, not a surrender. Men like Holloway did not surrender in public, but a step back, a recalculation of the terrain. After the meeting, in the street outside the hall, Holloway stopped beside Caleb on the way to his horse. Fitch and the lawyer were ahead of him. He stopped and said quietly, without the pleasant surface or the careful remove, "You have a capable wife, Whitaker." Caleb looked at him. "I know." The documentation was thorough. A pause. "Better than I expected." "She generally is." Holloway looked at him for a moment. Something passed across his face. Not warmth, not exactly, but the acknowledgement of a man to a man who had held his ground. "This doesn't mean I'm done with the valley's water situation." "I know that too. But the Whitaker property." He paused, made a slight adjustment in his expression that was as close to concession as a man like him made in public. "I'll find other approaches." "That would be sensible," Caleb said. Holloway walked to his horse. He rode away in the gray October light with Fitch and the lawyer behind him, and Caleb stood in the street and watched him go. Eliza came to stand beside him. She was still holding one of the document folders, which she had brought down from the hall after the meeting. She looked at Holloway's retreating back. "What did he say?" she asked. "That you were thorough." She was quiet for a moment. "That's all?" "Essentially." "And?" Caleb looked at her. "And I think he's going to look for a different angle. But not this one. Not right now." She nodded. She looked at the empty street, the gray sky overhead, the familiar shapes of Harlan Creek in the fall afternoon. "Martha has Thomas until 4. "I know." "We should go get him." "We should." She looked at him sideways. "You did well in there." "You did better." "Yes," she agreed without false modesty. "I did." She started walking toward the Ogle house, and he fell in beside her, and their footsteps on the wooden boardwalk were the ordinary sound of 2 people going to get their son on a Saturday afternoon, and the ordinary sound of it was the finest thing Caleb Whitaker had heard in years. The rain came on a Wednesday. Not a dramatic storm. No lightning, no thunder announcing itself across the valley like something that needed to be witnessed. Just rain. The steady, unremarkable kind that the ground had been waiting for without knowing it could still hope. Caleb woke at 5 in the morning to the sound of it on the roof and lay still for a moment, listening, because he had been in Texas long enough to know that what sounded like rain sometimes wasn't, that the sound of wind through dry grass could trick a sleeping man into something close to joy before he was fully awake and the disappointment arrived. But it was rain. He got up and went to the window and stood there in the gray dark, watching the water come down. And after a while he heard Eliza come to stand beside him, and neither of them said anything because there wasn't anything to say that the sound wasn't already saying better. Thomas slept through the first hour of it. When he woke and came to the kitchen and heard the roof and looked at the window and understood what he was hearing, he said, "Is that?" And Caleb said yes before he finished the sentence. And Thomas went to the door and opened it and stood in the doorway with his feet on the threshold and his face tipped slightly upward. "It's cold," he reported. "Rain usually is," Eliza said. "I like it." He stood there another moment. Then, "Is the reservoir filling?" "If it's raining here, it's raining up the watershed too," Caleb said. "The channels will be moving." Thomas looked at him with the expression that meant he needed to see this for himself and was calculating how quickly he could make that happen. "Can we go look?" They went at noon when the rain had eased to a drizzle. All three of them, in coats, Thomas in the middle with his boots making satisfying sounds in the newly soft ground. The north pasture smelled the way land smells when it finally gets what it needed. Not the pleasant decorative smell of rain on clean pavement somewhere civilized, but the deep, almost violent smell of dry earth releasing something it had been holding for too long. The reservoir was 3 inches higher than the morning before. The channel from the barn roof was running a steady, clear thread of water. The eastern channel, the one Eliza had adjusted 10 degrees north, the one they had argued gently about for an afternoon before he'd agreed she was right, was carrying more water than either of them had anticipated. Thomas stood at the edge and looked down at the rising water with the wooden horse in his hand and an expression of complete satisfaction. "It worked," he said, the same words he'd used the first time. But different now, fuller. That first time had been the surprise of something barely dared. This was the confirmation of something they had built and believed in through the weeks it was uncertain, through the legal challenge and the night with the shovels and the town meeting and all the days of weather watching with the particular anxiety of people whose survival was attached to what the sky did. "It worked," Caleb said. Eliza crouched at the waterline and put her fingers in. Cold, dark water, the same water Thomas had touched that first day. She looked at her wet hand for a moment, and Caleb watched her face, and what was on it was something he had not seen there before. Not the relief of a problem solved, but the deeper thing underneath the relief. The feeling of having built something real and seen it hold. She looked up at him. My father would have had something precise to say about the flow rate. What would he have said? She considered it. Probably something like adequate, given the gradient. She smiled. The full version, rare and worth waiting for. He wasn't effusive. Neither are you, Caleb said. No. She stood up. But I'm standing in a wet field in October next to a reservoir we dug by hand, and I think that says something. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him with the ease of someone who has decided to trust the ground they are standing on. And Thomas looked at the water and then at them and apparently decided this was all acceptable because he turned back to the reservoir and began telling the wooden horse about the channel system with the patient thoroughness of someone who has recently learned something and wants to make sure all parties are informed. Roy Stokes withdrew his water complaint formally that November in a brief letter to the county that said almost nothing and meant a great deal. Caleb heard about it from Tull, who delivered the news with the understated satisfaction of a man who had been waiting for it. Roy Stokes did not apologize. He was not, in Caleb's estimation, going to apologize. He was too small in his particular way for that. But he stopped speaking about the Whitaker Ranch and the feed store, and he nodded when he passed Eliza on the main street, which was the closest thing to acknowledgement a man like that could manage, and was, Caleb decided, sufficient. Grant Holloway did not disappear from the valley. Caleb had not expected him to. Men with that kind of money and that kind of appetite for acquisition did not simply redirect themselves because of a town meeting and an adjudicator's report. But the nature of his presence changed. He was still there, still buying land where he could, still controlling certain supply contracts that gave him leverage with certain people. But the Whitaker Ranch was off his visible agenda, and the open pressure stopped, and the silence where the pressure had been was its own kind of answer. Caleb thought about this sometimes, about what it was, exactly, that had stopped Holloway. Not courage alone, though there had been that. Not the legal documents alone, though they had mattered. What had changed the calculation was that Holloway had come expecting to deal with a lonely man on a failing ranch, and had instead encountered something he hadn't accounted for. Two people who were each, separately, capable of holding their ground, and who together were something different again from the sum of what they were individually. A man who had spent 3 years failing to care about anything was harder to pressure than a man with obvious vulnerabilities. A woman who could build an airtight hydrological survey and present it to a room full of skeptical neighbors was not the convenient target that a mail-order bride with no local standing had appeared to be. Holloway had done his arithmetic on the wrong numbers. By the time he corrected the calculation, the cost of continuing had risen past what the land was worth to him, and he was, above all else, a man who understood cost. Thomas learned to ride that winter. Not well, not with any of the ease that would come in a few years when his body caught up to his ambition and his nerves settled into something more proportionate to his actual experience. He learned badly and enthusiastically, which was the right way to learn something you genuinely wanted to do. He fell off the colt twice and got back on both times with the determined expression of someone who has decided that falling is a data point rather than a verdict. The colt, who had grown since the summer and was beginning to develop opinions of his own that complicated the training considerably, seemed to have decided that Thomas was acceptable. Not easy, but acceptable. They suited each other, Caleb thought, in the way that two young things that don't quite know what they're doing sometimes find a working arrangement based mostly on stubbornness and proximity. He watched them from the fence on a Saturday afternoon in December, this boy who was his son now, in the only way that finally mattered, legally, daily, completely, and felt the feeling he had stopped expecting to feel again. Not happiness exactly, or not only happiness. Something more durable than that. The feeling of a man who has stopped waiting for the loss that is coming and started paying attention to what is actually in front of him. He had lost things. He would lose more things. That was the deal, the one nobody announces when you arrive and nobody can renegotiate on your behalf. His first wife. The baby. The 3 years of silence. These things had happened and they were still true and they were part of him. He was not a man who believed that new joy canceled old grief. I was a man who had learned, slowly and against his own resistance, that they could exist together, that the space inside a person was not so small that one had to leave for the other to be present. Eliza came to stand beside him at the fence. "He's going to fall again," she said. "Probably. He's leaning too far forward. He knows. He'll correct it or he won't." She watched Thomas make a lopsided circle on the colt, correcting and overcorrecting and correcting again, with the endless trial and error of a child who has not yet developed the self-consciousness to be embarrassed by the process. "He's like my father," she said. "Keeps looking at the problem until he understands it." "He's like you," Caleb said. She was quiet for a moment. "I hope so," she said. "In the useful ways." What are the useful ways? She thought about it seriously, the way she thought about things that deserved consideration. Precision, patience, not stopping when the ground is hard. She paused. The willingness to pick up a shovel when someone needs help with something that matters. He looked at her. "That's a good list." "It's his list," she said. "He already has all of it. I can see it." Thomas made it around the full circle and pulled the colt to a stop at the gate, grinning with the whole-face grin that had become one of Caleb's private measures of how well things were going. "Did you see that?" "We saw it," Caleb said. "I almost fell on the corner." "I know. You didn't." Thomas considered this distinction with appropriate gravity. "Next time I won't almost," he decided, and turned the colt around for another attempt. Eliza shook her head slowly. "Definitely like my father," she said. The spring came the way it was supposed to. Slowly, then all at once, the gray loosening and the ground warming and the cattle putting on weight that they'd lost in the drought. The reservoir had held through the winter, through 2 more rain events that had filled the channels and run clean into the cistern, and the water level in early April was the highest it had been since Caleb had owned this land. He hired a second man to help with the cattle, not because he could easily afford it, but because the ranch was finally producing enough that a second man made economic sense, which was a sentence he had not been able to say in 3 years. He repaired the south fence, all 4 sections. He did it over 3 days, working from first light, and on the last day Thomas came and held boards while Caleb drove nails, which was not very efficient and added an hour to the work and was the best hour of those 3 days. He paid down half the Abilene debt. These were small things. They were not the resolution of a story, because his life was not a story with a resolution. It was a life, ongoing and unfinished, with the ordinary ratio of good days to hard ones, and the occasional disaster, and the persistent question of whether the work you are doing is going to amount to anything. He knew that. He had always known it. What had changed was not the uncertainty, but what he brought to the uncertainty, which was 2 people instead of 1, and a boy who carried a wooden horse and had opinions about everything. The family you build out of the wreckage of the life you expected is not a consolation prize. That is what Caleb understood, standing on the porch on an April evening watching the light go long and gold across a pasture that had water in its ground again. It is not the thing you settle for when the thing you wanted didn't work out. It is its own thing entirely, earned differently, built differently, resting on a different foundation, and stronger in some ways for having been assembled by people who understood what it cost to lose something and chose, in full knowledge of that cost, to try again. He had walked away from a railway station bench with a woman and a boy who had nothing and nowhere, and he had done it without a plan and without certainty, and because the alternative was a version of himself he did not want to be. That was the whole of it, not heroism, not even, really, generosity, just a refusal to walk away from 2 people who needed the world to not be as indifferent as it was showing every sign of being. And the world, in this particular instance, had returned the favor. Eliza came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat in the other chair and handed him one. The coffee was strong and slightly too hot, the way she always made it. He had stopped mentioning this. It was, he had decided, not a complaint worth making. Thomas was inside at the kitchen table drawing. He had moved from charcoal to a set of pencils Martha Ogle had given him for his 6th birthday, and his drawings had gotten more ambitious in proportion to his materials. He was, last Caleb had seen, drawing the reservoir in careful detail, with channels and measurements labeled in the painstaking block letters of a child who had been taught that precision mattered. He labeled the East Channel, Eliza said. He asked me how to spell gradient. What did you tell him? I told him. Then I told him what it meant. She held her cup. He said he already knew what it meant. Caleb smiled. Does he? More or less, She looked at the pasture. He's going to be good at this. The technical thinking. She paused. If there's a way to give him more formal education, mathematics, engineering principles. There's a school starting in Haskell next year. I heard about it from Martha. How far is Haskell? Far enough that it would require planning. She looked at him. I'm not saying now, I'm saying eventually. Eventually, he agreed. This was how they planned, not in declarations, but in gradually, in eventually, in the quiet accumulation of intentions that would become decisions when the time was right. It was the way 2 practical people who had both been burned by certainty learned to move toward the future without demanding that it commit to them first. The evening settled in. The cattle made their sounds in the north pasture. Somewhere past the barn, the colt shifted his weight against the fence in the bored, repetitive way he had, and Caleb made a mental note to give him more work tomorrow because an idle colt was a troublesome colt, and Thomas was not yet ready for troublesome. Caleb, Eliza said. Yeah. She was looking at the pasture. The light was almost gone, just a thin gold line at the horizon where the day was finishing its business. I was on that platform for 3 hours, she said, after Edmund Greer didn't come. I sat there and I thought I had made the worst decision of my life. Coming all this way, trusting a letter, a name, a promise. She paused. I thought Thomas was going to grow up watching me try to recover from my own foolishness. Caleb said nothing. He waited. And then this man walked over, she said, who didn't know me and had no reason to stop and looked like he hadn't slept well in about 3 years, and he asked if we needed somewhere to go. She looked at him. You were so uncomfortable, she said. You had no idea what you were doing. I still don't, he said. I know. Something in her voice was quiet and full and completely unguarded. But you stopped. That's the thing. When it would have been easier to keep walking, you stopped. She looked at her hands. I think about that. What a small thing it was. What a large thing it turned out to be. He thought about it too sometimes, the version of that afternoon where he didn't stop, where he told himself it wasn't his business, which would have been true, and walked past, which would have been easy, and went back to a ranch that was dying and spent the next few years watching it finish the job. The version of himself that existed in that branch of things was not a bad man. He was just a man who had let his grief convince him that the world was finished offering him anything worth having. He was glad he had been wrong about that. "I stopped," he said, "because your son was trying to be brave and he was 5 and it broke something open in me that I thought I had sealed up." He looked at her. "I'm glad it did." Eliza nodded once. She looked back at the horizon, where the last of the light was going. Inside, Thomas called, "Mama, how do you spell cistern?" Eliza closed her eyes briefly, the expression of a woman summoning patience that was actually very close to the surface and did not require much summoning. "Cistern," she called back. A pause. Then, "Is that a real word?" "It is a very real word," Eliza said. "You have been playing next to one for 6 months." Silence. Then the sound of pencil on paper. Caleb looked at the dark pasture and the full reservoir and the lit kitchen window with the small shape of a boy bent over his drawings, and he held his too-hot coffee and thought, this is the thing, not the dramatic version, not the moment at the station, or the night with the rifle, or the town meeting, or the rain filling the channels. Those were the events. This was the thing itself, this ordinary, imperfect, slightly too hot evening on a porch that needed repainting, with a woman beside him who made strong coffee and thought in gradients, and a boy inside who wanted to know how to spell the names of things he was learning to understand. This was what it meant to not be alone. He had forgotten and then remembered, and the remembering had cost him enough that he was not going to take it lightly again. The last of the light went. The stars came out over the Texas plain the way they always did, completely, without reservation, as if darkness were simply the condition under which they finally had room to show what they were. Caleb and Eliza sat on the porch and drank their coffee and did not need to say anything else, because the evening was saying it and the reservoir was saying it, and the sound of a 6-year-old carefully spelling out the names of things he intended to understand was saying it better than either of them could. The broken spur was not broken anymore, and the man who had stopped at a railway platform because a small boy was trying to be brave had gotten back. In the end, more than he had known he was missing, which is perhaps the only way such things ever come. Not announced, not deserved in any clean and simple sense, just offered, quietly, to the person who was still paying enough attention to notice.